Thank you for joining us for our chromatography webinar, Basics of Prep HPLC. If you have any questions during the webinar, please utilize the chat or question and answer functions within Zoom. All questions will be answered at the end. The webinar will be recorded and a video will be made available in the next few days. Our presenter today is Josh Lovell, Teledyne ISCO Application Specialist. With that, I'll turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Sharon. So today's webinar is going to be regarding improving Prep HPLC chromatography and some choices and techniques that you can make to improve your Prep HPLC separation. There's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me via email if you have any questions regarding this webinar or any other application associated questions. So today, outline of what we'll be discussing today is we'll be discussing the principles and components involved in Prep HPLC separation, different ways to optimize Prep HPLC methods to increase your throughput, guidelines for sample loop loading and eliminating sample loss, basic column care and protection, and then solvent loading choice and its effect on loading capacity and chromatographic integrity. So we're going to begin with some Prep HPLC basics, and these are principles for Prep HPLC separations. And so ultimately, is the ultimate question is what drives chromatographic separations? And for liquid chromatography, this consists of two phases. One, our mobile phase, which is a liquid, and then a stationary phase, and this consists of whatever our column packing or stationary phase is. And so we're limited by the solubility of our sample in some type of loading solvent. And what is driving the chromatographic separation is the interaction between your molecule of interest, in this case, in this picture, is the blue molecule, with the solvent molecules, in this case, isopropanol or water mixture, and then the functionalized silica groups here on the stationary phase. So how well that molecule interacts with the mobile phase and the stationary phase is going to dictate how fast it travels down the column. This is a reverse phase representation, which would be similar to what you would encounter in Prep HPLC. For normal phase, your mobile phase would be a weak to strong organic solvent, and you'd be interacting with the bare silica without functionalization in most cases. So why choose Prep HPLC? Our ultimate goal is to purify a mixture of compounds. So we want to get our target compound as pure as possible. And to quantify the separation of different compounds, we use the resolution. We define that as resolution. The equation for resolution is here, and it consists of three components. The first component, the N value, refers to the efficiency. The second component, the alpha component, is the selectivity. And the portion consisting of the K represents the retention. And so each of these is going to have a different magnitude impact on the resolution equation based upon the formula listed here. So to kind of visualize that, we're going to first look at how retention can affect the resolution equation. So retention, which is our K value, is a capacity factor, retention factor. And this is ultimately the retention time of a compound on the column. And this factors in the dead volume. So your solvent front basically travels time 0 down the column, and the amount of time that it takes for your compound, the retention time, is TR. So K is TR minus the solvent front divided by the solvent front. A higher K value indicates that the sample interacts strongly with the stationary phase. So really, K values above 20, the compound's really just sitting at the head of the column. It's not really eluting at all. It's just sitting at the top of the column, not moving down. And as we get to K values between 1 and 10, now that compound starts to elute down the column, and we can take advantage of the separation and the interaction between the stationary phase and the mobile phase of the compound. As we get a retention value that's smaller than 1, then that means that the compound is basically traveling at the solvent front. So we're not getting really any retention. Compound is not retained at all, and it's traveling with the solvent front at the highest linear velocity. The retention is greatly affected by changing the solvent system strength. So gradient elution, as we go from 0 to 100%, we increase the strength of %B. This inherently takes advantage of modifying the retention to a lower K value, where it's staying on top of the column. As they increase the strength, it starts to travel. The next section here is we're going to look how the selectivity factor affects resolution. And so selectivity is really important because it defines how two different molecules are going to interact with the media. So if two compounds interact similarly, they have the same selectivity, so we're not going to be able to get very good resolution because they are basically behaving similarly in regards to the stationary phase or the mobile phase. So they're going to travel similarly. We want to be able to maximize the selectivity for one compound over another in order to improve the separating power of the chromatography system. And so selectivity is probably going to have the most drastic impact on the resolution equation. So as we increase the selectivity from 1 to 1.25, we basically have a linear magnitude. If we improve the selectivity, we're improving the resolution by a very similar factor. The retention time or retention factor of the resolution equation has kind of a plateauing effect. So we can only really maximize the K value to a certain point. So we see very good impact in changing the retention from 0 to 5, but from 5 to 10, the gain's not so great on resolution. And as we get above 10, it really plateaus off. So we really want to work with a K range from 0 to 10 for retention. And increasing the retention more doesn't really do anything. It's just sitting at the top of the column. And then finally, the efficiency equation basically defines how well the column is working. It defines column performance. And you can see, once again, it doesn't plateau off as much as the K value, but it really has diminishing returns over time because it's the square root of the efficiency being factored into the resolution equation. So it's not as great of a magnitude gain as with selectivity. So ways that we can adjust the selectivity. So we can affect selectivity in several different ways. One of the easiest ways is just to change your solvent system. So in this example from an analytical column, we have a 5-component mixture here. And we see clear elution for peaks 1, 2, and 3, and then 4 and 5 kind of co-elute together in 40% acetonitrile. If we change to 50% methanol, we actually see that peaks 2 and 3 now co-elute, but 4 and 5 are now isolable, and we get baseline resolution between them. So as we change from acetonitrile to methanol, we've changed the selectivity of the system so that 4 and 5 are now interacting differently with the mobile phase versus 2 and 3, which are now interacting similarly on the mobile phase to each other. So depending on which compound you're interested in purifying, one method would be more suitable than the other. Another component that can have a drastic impact on the selectivity is by adjusting the pH of the mobile phase. So as we add modifiers, acidic or basic modifiers, so acidic modifiers that are common would be TFA, formic acid, and then basic modifiers like ammonium salts or triethylamine, we can see how in this example, as we change the pH by 0.1 unit, from 5.2 to 5.1, that we're able to get separation between peaks 5 and 6. But at 5.2, more towards neutral, we're not able to get that separation. And then finally, more kind of a more drastic change, and there's a lot more options for different columns, is to change the stationary phase. So in this case, we get separation of peaks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 using a cyano column. However, if we change to a functionalized phenyl column, peaks 4 and 5 are no longer, they're co-eluting, so we don't have baseline resolution between them. So in this case, the cyano column offers us better selectivity for isolating out all of 7 peaks. And the mobile phase also changed too, so 35% acetonitrile to 48%. The last component of the resolution equation is efficiency. So with Prep HPLC, you know, we already have greater plate number performance in our flash columns because we're working with smaller particle sizes. The efficiency effectively describes the broadening of the band, and this, you know, ultimately relates to column performance. So the one nice thing about efficiency, though, with columns that you're reusing is it's a good indicator of column integrity. So once you start to see your efficiency begin to decrease over time, then there usually needs to be some sort of change, you know, change to your column, change your guard column. Your column performance is, the physical characteristics of your column are starting to change and it's starting to affect your chromatography. But if your efficiency is staying relatively, your plate count is staying relatively the same for that column over time, you know that you're working with a column that's working well. Another way we can affect efficiency is in our column choice. So we could choose a longer column to increase the separating power. Obviously, this increases the method time. The trade-off of this is that as we go back and if we were to go back and look at the resolution equation graph and the effect of efficiency, selectivity, and retention on it, efficiency, as you increase your efficiency by an order of 1, the magnitude of it isn't as great because it's basically the square of the efficiency. Another thing to note, if you're working with larger molecules, proteins, things like that, longer columns aren't necessarily going to provide greater efficiency for larger molecules. So keep that in mind. For small molecules, though, longer columns are going to provide better separating power. The other things that kind of go into efficiency is not only your column, but also your injection volume, which we're going to discuss in detail later because that's something that we can control. Basically, that initial band broadening at the top of the column as we load our sample. Dead volume in the system, and then the flow rate. So we're working in the optimal flow rate for our columns. So there's an optimal flow rate of, you know, for example, 20 millimeter column, the optimal flow rate is about 18.9 for a 10 micron size column, or 5 micron size column. As we start to increase, we can increase the flow rate, but we start to deviate a little bit from optimal efficiency numbers, although the particle size is kind of forgiving for that. So we can go ahead and increase that as long as we don't have limitations with back pressure. So in general, a Prep HPLC system is a very similar path as a flash system or an analytical HPLC system. We have our solvent reservoirs, where we have our A and B solvents. We have our gradient former and pumps. And so we're mixing our solvents and delivering a certain percent solvent strength. And then we have a sample introduction valve, which we're going to discuss sample introduction in great detail here. But that's something where a component area of the system where we can make improvements to our separations. And then we have our separation column, which we've already discussed some column characteristics and how that affects our resolution and our separations. And then as your compounds elute down the column and get separation, then we need to be able to detect them so that we can trigger fraction collection, or if you're using analytical HPLC, then you can do integration or quantitation. And so we're going to discuss a little bit regarding some factors in optimizing your method for detection too. So in general, there's kind of two types of solvent delivery methods you can do. You can do an isocratic method, and this is a constant solvent composition. So I'm running it at 30% methanol water the entire time, and the compounds are going to come out. When they come out, there's usually going to be a larger gap between the compounds. This offers the highest resolution, though, because of that large gap between compounds, because essentially your retention's going to be really high for one compound and not for the other. As you get compounds that start to co-elute, we need to work towards an isocratic method to get separation to maximize that. One of the advantages of isocratic separations is it does permit stacked injections, as you can purify multiple injections of the same compound over and over because your solvent composition is not varying. More commonly, though, in Prep HPLC with purifications, especially small molecules, things like that, or you're purifying from multiple impurities, is a gradient method. So there's two variants of this. You can do step gradients, and you'll see this in flash chromatography production scale, where basically you'll run it like 10% of B solvent, and then you'll do that for a period of time, and then you'll jump up to 30, up to 50%, and just slowly jump up so you can isolate each compound. And so it's basically a series of isocratic steps. What seems to be more effective is linear gradient, so basically running a gradient from 0 to, or from 10 to 100%, depending on your column, and then doing a, so this basically changes the retention of the solvents, of your compounds as the solvent strength increases. So this increasing solvent strength allows separation of compounds. It is going to minimize resolution between compounds, so they're going to come out kind of back to back, but it's going to be faster. So one way we can take advantage of this is to do focus gradients. So do a focus gradient over the solvent strength of the system where your compound's actually eluting down the column. And so this gives similar resolution as an isocratic method, and then allows some error in setting up optimal solvent composition. So we'll discuss that a little further for method development in the next section. So Prep HPLC method development. And so what are the goals of optimizing our method or developing it? To allow for faster runs, we want to be able to purify our compound quickly. We want to be able to purify as much compound as possible, as quick as possible, so we can maximize the loading of the sample onto the column. This also allows us to minimize solvent usage by using an optimal method, because we can we can minimize the time of the method to allow baseline resolution. So we just need a baseline resolution to get separation. We don't need the extra gap in between compounds eluting. We don't gain anything by that because it's just clean solvent, basically. And it also minimizes any workup from our fractions. So if you guys use volatile modifiers, you prefer to use volatile modifiers that you can evaporate quickly. One of the common ways in a lot of labs that people are using to develop Prep HPLC methods is to take an analytical system and basically develop a set of zones. So they do an analytical scouting gradient on their analytical system, and they know that if a compound comes out in the specific zone, that they need to run a gradient profile of a certain percent B to a certain percent B. So, for example, here we have a peak that comes out at 5.075. So this is right in the middle of zone 3, and so it would suggest that we run a gradient from 25 to 45% B. And so basically anything outside of that zone is going to, resolution is going to devolve. So peaks that come out later are probably going to co-elute as one peak late. And then peaks that come out earlier are going to co-elute as one peak also. But you're going to have a larger gap between the compound at around 5 minutes there and the impurities next to it at 3.7 and 6.3 minutes. So we maximize the resolution around that. What we can do then is that we can then increase the loading of the compound to maximize that dead space there, because we've optimized our method to where that compound is eluting and separating down the column. Usually this is set up in the lab, so they've ran their analytical system, and you've run tests to kind of calibrate your prep system to your analytical system. The other thing to keep in mind is that for this kind of correlation to work, you need to be using the same column chemistry. That way you have the same selectivity in your prep and your analytical. One limitation of this is that as you deviate from the middle of the zone, so if you're at the edge of a zone, so say that peak around 3.7, if that was after 4 minutes, we would go ahead and be in zone 3 there, so we'd be eluting it faster. You start to lose optimal resolution. So This is one of the limitations of this, is that if you get to the extremes of the zone, you're starting to lose some resolution ability and separating power. So here's an example just to show you how focusing a gradient over a certain range can improve your resolution. So this is just a series of different parabens. As we run this run from I think 10 to 100% here, we can see the initial DMSO peak, that big broad peak in the beginning, and then some impurities, and then we see the 4 parabens coming through. And you get baseline resolution for most peaks 3 and 4 there, kind of coalute. But if we were to go ahead and focus this gradient over a range from 67 to 77% there, basically you can see the improved results on the bottom there. Now we're getting minutes of baseline separation between compounds. And so what that allows us to do is that now we can increase the loading of the compound to maximize our throughput. So on the AccuPrep, we have a really neat feature that we've incorporated a focus gradient generator to help with method development on the AccuPrep. And so this is really useful when multiple injections are needed. It provides a simple, easy user interface that calculates close to optimal conditions for you. The nice thing compared to the zone method here is that it's going to predict a value that's unique to each compound. So if you're on the edge of a zone, it's going to actually choose a range that's centered around that peak, not necessarily just putting you into a zone. Very easy to use. It eliminates the need to program a series of focus gradients into your system as defaults, and allows you to customize it for each unique separation that you have. It also basically allows you to use your HP 150 as an analytical system, as you can run a 4.6 millimeter column and then scale up to your larger run, or you could even self-scout on the same column and just doing a small injection. The AccuPrep has a feature on it that allows you to bypass the loop when you use a smaller column. And this helps to reduce the delay volume on the 4.6 millimeter column. And so you can run your scouting method on any size column and then scale up to a larger column as needed, or scale up to the same column with larger loading. So the focus gradient generator procedure is kind of a quick walkthrough to kind of illustrate how it occurs. So essentially, when you install a column on the AccuPrep, you need to create the scouting method, and we do this in our configuration screen under the Prep HPLC tab. You select your column, hit Define Methods, and then choose New Scouting Method. So when that comes up, we can enter some variables unique to our scouting method. So depending on the column, we can change the initial %B. So with C18 columns, we normally work from 5 to 10% initial %B. But maybe you're using a C18AQ column, and so this expands your separation where you can go ahead and work down at 0% B. So for really polar compounds that are eluting early, the C18AQ is a good alternative column media for that to give you better retention. You can go ahead and name your method. You can create multiple scout methods where you run different gradients. Maybe you want to run it from 5%. 10%. You can create multiples. You can also create changes in your focus range there. You can do plus or minus 5%, plus or minus 10%. And then you can also adjust the flow rate. So if you like to run your columns faster, you can adjust that there, and it's automatically going to factor that into your scouting method. So now we go back to the main screen on the AccuPrep. We would select our column, and we would choose the scout method. That's what we named it, or whatever you named your scout method. And it's going to generate a method with a 6-minute gradient if you're running a 150 millimeter long column. If you're running a longer column, it's going to be longer. And then it's going to have a washout phase. Basically, just push everything through the system and off the column if you have any really strongly retained compounds. Essentially, the scout method is not going to let you change anything because all of these gradient the gradient profile is built into the algorithm, and if we make changes, then our algorithm is not correct. So you're basically locked out from making any changes to the gradient length. You can make detection changes in the method editor, however. So we go ahead and run the scouting method. We've got 5 components here in this mix. All of them are pretty well resolved, or we get baseline resolution between all of them, but keep in mind this is a scouting run, low injection volume, and low injection concentration. So we're not loading a lot of compound onto the column. So we can go ahead and, when the run's done, this screen's going to show up. The focus button here is going to be evident or visible when you do a scouting gradient. If you're not doing a scouting gradient, that button will not be visible. So you have to set it up properly in the configuration screen like we discussed. And basically, you're going to be able to just select a peak of interest. So say we're interested in purifying peak 3. I'm going to go ahead and select peak 3. I can zoom in on there if I need to and optimize the location. But that red cursor is essentially selecting where we want to focus our gradient around. Then the next choice is to go ahead and choose so move the red line to the desired peak, and then choose the column that we want to do our scale up on. So in this case, we're going to be scaling up to a 20 by 150 column, and then you're going to hit the focus button. But you could also scale up to any other columns you have installed on the system. And keep in mind that your scout and prep column must be the same media, otherwise your selectivities are different. We're going to see variability because of that. So your scout method is going to be loaded. So in this case, we chose peak number 3. It's going to generate a gradient from about 43 to 53% there. And we're going to run that. And you can see the resolution gain here. So now peak 3 here is going to elute around 6 minutes. The first 2 peaks are starting to co-elute. And that's fine. We weren't interested in recovering those, so that's something that we can sacrifice there, and we don't worry about that. And then you also notice peaks 4 and 5 are starting to have kind of some odd peak shape, but you do get baseline resolution there. But we get like 2 minutes on the front edge, and then 3 to 4 minutes on the back edge of resolution around peak 3. So now what we can do is we can go and scale up the loading of it and load more compound and maximize that empty space in the gradient with our increased loading of the compound. So the target peak is always going to kind of in the center of the gradient around 6. I would say 5 to 8 minutes that peak is going to come out. It just kind of depends on the unique compounds you're working with. But it's going to come out in the center of that gradient. So we've discussed the choices we have when we're doing method development for our prep separations. The next component that I really want to focus on is what's the sample prep and injection techniques and things like that for Prep HPLC, because there's a lot of choices that we can make that affect our chromatography, and we have some gains that we can make by making positive choices in regards to this. So kind of the first question really when you're doing sample reduction is what's the best technique for loading my sample? And so unlike flash chromatography, all your Prep HPLC loading of samples is via liquid. So we can do this several different ways. We can do manual injection through a Lure port. We can use an auto sampler or an auto injector that's syringe driven. And then recently on the HP150 we've added a feature with the sample load pump. And so this allows you to load large volumes of sample, of dilute sample potentially if you have solubility problems with some compounds. And it's really useful for peptide protein purifications and some other scale-up opportunities. So the key for liquid loading, though, is that the dissolution solvent is very important. And this is probably one of the most critical choices you can make in affecting your chromatography. And so the loading technique is going to affect your loading. So if you're doing the auto sampler, you can do multiple, or auto injector, you can do multiple injections. Auto sampler the same way. Sample load pump, you're doing usually a large volume of a really dilute sample. And then manual injection, you're kind of limited to whatever your syringe size is. So these different techniques affect the amount of compound we can load because of our loading volume. One of the most probably important things though in sample prep is we need to filter or centrifuge our samples, and this protects the system at the injection valve interface with the rotor seal. If we get particulates in there, eventually they're going to end up scratching and creating leaks in your injection valve, and you have to replace your rotor seal. Additionally, and probably more importantly because of the cost, is that it protects your column investment. So as we get those, if you have particulates in your sample, eventually those collect onto the frit of the column over time, and they're going to start to hinder your column performance and create column back pressure issues, things like that, and that's going to lead to column voids, and ultimately you're replacing your column sooner than you'd like. Some other things you can use to protect your column investment would be guard columns and inline filters. The guard columns basically act as a sacrificial media there for collecting particulate and heavily retained compounds. And you can easily replace the guard column for $400 versus spending $4,000 or more on a prep column. So once you start to see your efficiency starting to go, if you have a guard column and a column, replacing that guard column or taking that out of line and then doing the run on your column, you'll see the efficiency is fine for the column, but your guard column's gone bad. You can just replace that versus replacing your more expensive column. So one of the most important factors when we're loading our compound is how much can we load. And so this is a good guideline for the kind of the ranges of the amount of compound you can load onto a column and see good separations. Keep in mind, you have a range basically from 0.1 to 1% essentially if you're loading on reverse phase. If you're loading on the bare silica, you have a 1% to 10% range for your loading capacity there because you have more interaction with the silica because it's not functionalized. There's more silica there to interact with. The other thing to point out here is that the loading range there is going to be really unique to whatever your compound is and your closest eluting impurity. So if you have really close eluting compounds, you're going to have to really work on the low end of that scale. But if you have compounds that you have really good resolution around, then we can go ahead and maximize that loading and work towards the top end. This is kind of a useful guide. It's also got optimal flow rates for the column sizes and then the approximate column volume, so you can kind of get an idea where compounds are coming out in regards to column volume there. And so the manual injection options, you have the lower port adapter. This is easy for large amounts via syringe. The limitations of it are though you get potential loss of sample if you're not flushing after injection, just due to the distance from the lower port to the injection rotor. The other thing is you shouldn't exceed 50% of the loop size because of user variation and experience. So as you inject that in, you kind of create a laminar flow profile, and you start to inject. As you're injecting, sample starts to come out the back end of the loop into the waste. So you don't want to exceed 50% of the loop size using the lower port adapter. And this ultimately has inferior reproducibility and technique to your auto injection or auto samplers. Another alternative is a lot of people like to use the blunt tip needle port. And this is useful for method development on the analytical scale where sample loss needs to be mitigated. Just like see this on a lot of analytical systems. There's no need to flush the injection port because you're basically injecting right onto the where the rotor valve and the seal meet. The only limitations of this is the needle gauge size required isn't really optimal for prep scale injections because you're injecting larger volumes, so you're going to be taking a longer time to load your sample. And once again, because of user variation, it has inferior reproducibility and technique to the auto injector, auto sampler modules. So the auto injector here is a really neat feature. It allows multiple injections without having any user feedback or interaction. So you can do multiple runs sequentially. You're going to get improved peak shape and separation compared to your manual injections because it's a reproducible injection procedure. You can do injection volumes down to 10 microliters with the auto injector, and the only limitation is that you use one sample at a time. So you can, and you only can do one. You can modify the injection volume after the fact, I guess. So, and then you need to wash the auto injector probe following a sequence on the system there, so that it doesn't get clogged up or precipitate out to clog it up. Now the auto sampler is really builds upon this. So you get the same. You can do multiple different samples with multiple injections without any user interaction. It allows you to change the injection volumes or different chromatographic methods. If you want to scout different methods, you can do that for the same sample. You can allow the system to stop after you do your first injection. Maybe you want to confirm that those are good, those are the appropriate conditions, optimal conditions for your run before you continue. And it'll pause and wait for interaction. Otherwise, it's going to run through the queue line by line until it's done without any interaction. And then it's got a completely automated wash process, so you don't have to worry about washing out the sampler probe. And then you get additional fraction collection capacity because of additional 2 or 4, depending on which auto sampler you have, rack spaces. So here are some good habits, no matter what you're doing, auto sampler, auto injector, manual injection, sample prep, choices to make to protect your prep column investment. So first, generic column care. Read the instructions unique to your column. They should have a maximum pressure, and you can set that in the AccuPrep software unique to each column when you set up your columns. It should also tell you what allowable solvents you can use on it, pH limit, so if you're using modifier, what pH range you can get into. And they should have storage conditions located on it. When you're done using a column, it's very beneficial to wash out any buffers or modifiers you've used, such as TFA, acetic acid, formic acid, and store it in a strong solvent or the solvent recommended in the storage conditions. And this prevents precipitation and then breakdown of your bonded phase through hydrolysis of the functional groups there. So normally you're going to store this in a strong solvent. We don't want any bacteria or biologics growing in the column if you have a high aqueous content. So normally you want to be at least 50% organic modifier to store it in, or whatever is suggested by your column. So column issues that you can see in the chromatogram. So when you start to see peak splitting, a lot of times that's because you've started to develop voids in your column or gaps. And a lot of times this is caused from pressure spikes, a lot of times from DMSO. This is DMSO is very viscous when it goes onto the column and creates kind of a pressure spike at the head of the column. Using guard columns helps minimize this kind of damage. Higher flow rates is something, if you're working at higher flow rates consistently on your columns outside of the range that's specified, you can start to see voids develop in your column. And then pH issues, if you're using silica-based columns, if you go to pH larger than 7.5, you start to see some hydrolysis of the silica there. And that's something that will help, that will develop voids, and you'll see poor column performance. The thing is, at low pH, silyl ethers hydrolysis, so being in the correct pH range for your compounds, and then loss of the bonded phase is going to cause peak splitting issues and poor retention. And it's good to wash the modifiers from our columns before storage overnight. So next question is, how does sample dissolution solvent affect my chromatography? So I'm going to go to a flash example because we can actually visualize what's going on here. But this would be very similar for prep injection. So this is doing a liquid injection on a flash column, and we've got the clear column body, so we can actually see what's going on in the silica as we load the compound. And so on the left here is a picture of the column with the compound And as we inject it, as we've injected it, it's already running down the column. It's almost to the bottom of the column. It's not well dissolved in that with that solvent that we've chosen. On the right here, we've chosen a weak solvent to dissolve it in, and we've taken more solvent to dissolve it, but and more solvent volume. But you can see once we've loaded it, we don't see any elution down the column front there. And so with the actual chromatography there, you can see the peak width of about let's say 5 minutes there on the left versus 3 minutes on the right there. So you can see the band broadening just by loading in a strong solvent. And so we weren't always trying to dissolve it in the weak solvent for our sample loading. So considerations for your loading solvent: you would compromise between good dissolution while minimizing the effect on the integrity of your chromatography. And so if you're using a polar compound, a lot of times we use this, use DMSO it's really good for dissolving things. With polar compounds, we have to use DMSO a lot to help dissolve it and then load it onto the column. So this is just an example where DMSO is used to load onto the column at 1 milliliter injection of DMSO and sample here. And we did the same injection, or same concentration, but 2.5 milliliters of it. And you start to see that we get peak fronting, a peak 2 where we had resolution with 1 milliliter injection, but as we increase the injection, we start to get peak fronting and force separation. So we've kind of maxed out how much we can load onto the column with this method. Now, if we would have loaded this in a weaker solvent, maybe more of a weaker solvent, then we would still have baseline resolution, and we wouldn't have encountered the pore separation conditions with the DMSO. So in this case, we dissolved that same concentration in 2.5 mils of water, and we're able to get baseline separation of the peaks here on the top. And so since we have baseline resolution to spare there, we can go ahead and increase the loading and load 4 milliliters of water. So now we've loaded 4 times as much as we did in the DMSO sample, and increased our throughput that way. So keep in mind, this is obviously compounds that dissolve, we're able to dissolve in water and DMSO, but it illustrates the effect that we can have with that by trying to move to a weaker solvent. And one of the last things we're discussing today is prep sample injection volume and loop size. And so this is kind of an important consideration, is how much sample can I load on there. And so based on some past literature, there's kind of several different outcomes based on your injection technique. And so one of the valve manufacturers suggests to fill the loop no more than halfway when doing your partial loop injection, which is essentially what you do on prep all the time, because you don't want to lose any sample in order to maintain your precision and avoid sample loss. And the basis for this is that as we load our sample, we basically get a laminar flow profile where the sample fluid has a parabolic velocity profile, and the velocity at the center of the tube is about twice the average at the wall of the tube. Well, the velocity at the wall of the tube is 0, sorry. And the average velocity is in between. So the exact effect on laminar flow profile is also dependent on the loop geometry and loading flow rate. So if you're running it, if you're injecting at slower rates, as with our auto injector, we don't see this laminar flow profile. It's not as significant. So essentially, there's 3 regions of injection variability, and the partial filling region is, so this region is volumetric precision is determined by the syringe. So basically, if I had a 1 mil syringe and I load up to 50% with a syringe, so I inject 500 microliters via syringe, I'm going to be within 1% of my injection volume. It's limited by the syringe and the operator technique. The nonlinear region would be the region probably from 500 to 1 milliliter for that loop size. In this region, we start to see fluid front start to begin to dilute and then exit the sample loop after loading. And so obviously this is going to lead to sample loss and inferior performance, most importantly sample loss for Prep HPLC. And then normally for analytical, if we want to do an analytical injection, we want to inject 100 microliters, we're going to have a 100 microliter loop. We're going to inject 3 to 5 times that into the loop and overfill the loop, and that way we know that the loop is completely filled with sample. And this gives us a 0.1% RSD. But you obviously have lost 4 times your sample out the back end of the sample loop. So this is not a feasible alternative for our prep scale separations. So another valve manufacturer suggests a loading technique to help eliminate this laminar flow profile and then increase your sample loop loading. And then it also prevents mixing between the sample fluid and your mobile phase. So if we were to put a small air bubble preceding the sample fluid and basically separate the mobile phase from the sample plug, it eliminates that laminar flow profile. And that laminar flow profile only occurs if mixing is allowed to occur in the loop. The authors noted that the precision and accuracy of partial loop loading are still functions of the operator of the syringe, though. So with the auto injector and the reproducibility of the auto injector for your auto sampler, we can decrease the variation there. And this increases the range of linearity of the partial filling loop of the loop size. And this has been independently verified using multiple manufacturers' valves. So how does this affect our AccuPrep and the auto injector and how we use Prep HPLC though? So both manufacturers agree that the precision and accuracy of partial loop loading are functions of the operator in the syringe. So that's the biggest variable there and where we can see the biggest variability. The auto injector option offers an automated consistent method for injection. We have a controlled flow rate for loading from run to run and consistent valve switch timing. And this reproducibility helps to eliminate errors due to operator handling or variation. And the auto sampler takes it a step further as it also incorporates a series of steps that isolate the sample fluid plug with air pockets. So the auto sampler is actually able to go through a sequence where it draws up a small amount of air to separate that sample plug from the mobile phase as we're injecting it. And then on the loop size, we talked about loop geometry being important. So in these smaller diameter loops, like 100 microliter, 1 milliliter loops, it's a 1/16 tubing throughout. And so this is good for loading small volumes. Smaller loop is great for the 4.6 millimeter column as you decrease your dwell volume. However, the larger you can't load above 50% of the loop size on this because we do see the laminar flow profile. We start to lose linearity of our injection volume. So this is where you don't want to go above 50% of your loop size for these smaller diameter loops. For larger loops, though, so traditionally, the systems are going to have 5 mil loops and larger, and that's a 1/8 out. It transitions from a 1/16 to a 1/18 OD tubing. That laminar flow profile changes on the transition from the tubing, and we see linearity throughout a longer range. So this increases our loading capacity. It also allows for dissolution and increased volume of weaker solvent, so you can improve your chromatography that way. And since sample recovery is paramount in prep, you can fill up to 1 milliliter less than the loop size for our AccuPrep system with negligible sample loss. So if I were working on a 5 milliliter loop, I could load 4 milliliters of sample, up to 4 mils without any sample loss. If I have a 10 milliliter loop, I can work up to 9 milliliters. If I have a 20 milliliter loop, I can work up to 19 milliliters of injection volume and see no sample loss out the back end. And this is part of the auto injector and auto sampler as they help incorporate, or the auto sampler helps incorporate that air bubble to help prevent that laminar flow profile additionally. So if you're in manual injection, though, we don't suggest loading more than 50% of the loop size because of operator variation. So in summary today, we discussed different principles between Prep HPLC separations. We highlighted some different approaches to method development and optimizations for resolution. We contrasted the benefits of different loading techniques. We showed the importance of choosing the best loading solvent and its effect on loading capacity and chromatographic integrity. And then we established some guidelines for sample loop loading and eliminating sample loss. So at this time, I want to open it up to any questions that you guys may have regarding Prep HPLC separations, maybe regarding any Prep HPLC topics I didn't discuss here. There's a lot of different things we could discuss, but open it to your guys' questions. So one thing that might be useful to some people, and we get some, I had a question regarding kind of detector settings here, is how we can optimize UV settings for maximized recovery. So one way to improve our separation is to be able to see our compounds better, and then be able to get better separation because we're able to detect them better. So we can detect impurities. So when we're looking to optimize the UV settings to maximize recovery, this helps our peak cutting algorithm because we can detect our peaks sooner to get better sample recovery that way. As we deviate from the optimal wavelength for a compound, we can significantly impact the detection and the fraction triggering and sample recovery. And so finding the optimal wavelength of your compound is really important for your separation if you're using UV. And so, ways you can use this is you have previous UV spectral data on your compound. However, you need to be aware of solvent and solvatochromatic effects due to the gradient composition. So if you're running at like 10% versus 70%, then you start to see some solvatochromatic shifts because of that. The other thing you do is you can use the UV-Vis spectral data from the AccuPrep. So if you guys have done a run, you can click down on the UV or UV-Vis function there on the bottom right of your run screen, and it's going to pull up a UV trace for your sample, and you can basically click a point in time and look at that UV trace. And so if you're doing future runs, maybe we're detecting at 254, but the optimal wavelength is really 270. So we're really kind of on the edge there, but at 270, we're at the peak. We're going to increase our detector sensitivity by monitoring at 270 instead. So this is a way you can improve your detection ability for your compounds and get better separation. So the nice thing about it is also as you're running the gradient, the point of time that compound is coming out is going to be the same solvent composition on future runs. So you don't have that solvatochromatic effect where that peak is shifting where I ran the UV at 10%, but really it's eluting at like 70% composition. So I don't see any other questions today, so I want to thank you guys for your time. We have a future webinar in February. Not sure the date. So yeah, I'm not sure the date, but we do have one coming up in February, I believe. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me directly or contact us through our website and any questions answered that way. But I thank you guys for your time and hope you guys have a good rest of the week.
Yes. Thank you, Josh, for your time in providing this webinar. And as Josh said, if you have any questions, you can either contact him directly or you can contact through Zoom. I will receive the email and I'll direct it to the appropriate person. This has been recorded and a video will be made available within the next week. Thank you again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.